Ja nüüd on aeg ära kuulata meie välisesinejad. Esimesena astub siis lavale Ühendkuningriigist Antony Dunkels. Ja kuna tänase konverentsi märksõnad on risk ja usaldus, siis finantssektoris peetakse usaldust ju eriti tähtsaks ja sellest me kuulemegi kohe. Palun.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with an apology, if I may. Firstly, not only have I taken you all away from your lunch, but I'm also going to be the first presenter, perhaps the only presenter, I don't know, that has to address you in English. And I'm going to talk about reputation, risk and resilience, and try and transpose some of what I've learned in the UK financial services market to the Estonian financial services sector. And if I can start, if I may, with a little bit of my background, because it is relevant to what I have to talk about. I was a criminal barrister in London for 13 years. I then moved to the Financial Conduct Authority, the financial regulator in London, to work on the foreign exchange rate fixing investigation that I'm sure many of you will know about, as a lawyer on that investigation. I then moved into communications, and I now advise businesses, banks or other businesses, and individuals on reputation risk, communications response, and issues management. So my move into communications really came from my time at the Financial Conduct Authority. The banks that were under investigation, and you may know there were 4 main global banks under the FX investigation, were equally concerned of the impact that the investigation would have on their reputations as they were by whatever financial sanction may be imposed at the end of the investigation. Equally, if not more concerned about the impact on their reputations. And indeed, much of the media reporting, certainly in the UK, of the FX investigations focused on the reputation harms suffered by the banks, the impact on share price. And those words were used: reputation disaster, PR disaster, irrecoverable or irreparable reputation harm. So this was an area, when I moved into communications, that I really chose to focus on and drill down and better understand. My talk is going to focus really on 7 key points. Firstly, collaboration between professional services advisors in preserving their clients' reputation in times of crisis. Secondly, I'm going to use Barclays as a bit of a case study of really how not to do it. So I hope there's no one from Barclays in the room. 3, the key threats that I've identified as being most relevant to financial services providers within the Estonian financial services sector. Fourthly, how do you measure reputation costs? Because everyone talks about it, but actually how do you quantify it? Because if you can't quantify it, it's much harder to mitigate reputation damage. I want to talk, fifthly, a little bit about the Estonian media landscape. Sixthly, about trust, because of course that is an important part of why we're all here today. And finally, very briefly, I want to go through the sort of basics of a crisis response that has application, in fact, not only to the financial services sector, but indeed to most of big business. Ooh. I call this area legally informed communications, merging legal expertise with communications necessities, professionalizing, if you like, the communications sector, because business critical issues are increasingly defined by a combined legal and communications response. As I mentioned in the cases of the banks under FCA investigation, they were equally concerned by the damage to their reputation as they were of any financial sanction or the output of the investigation. And a flawed communications response can be absolutely fatal to a business. So the key word really is collaboration. Professional services advisors must collaborate much more than they have done before. And a crisis response and litigation communications function should be an integral part of any big business, particularly those under considerable public scrutiny, or that hold large numbers of employees, or those operating in the regulated sector. So to give you examples from the banking and financial services, banks are, of course, under endless regulatory scrutiny and usually have to satisfy numerous regulators in different jurisdictions, sometimes which have competing or conflicting imperatives. Management at banks owe a duty of care to their stakeholders, to their shareholders, to their customers, and face an increasingly critical media, public, and indeed government. But they owe that duty of care to protect the business from reputation harm, and the key is collaboration and preparation. Because the consequences of not having a proper communications and crisis communications and litigation communications plan in place can have an absolutely catastrophic impact on a business. And it's really down to lack of information and understanding, misreporting, miscommunication, both internally within the business and indeed externally, all of which can send a share price tumbling, investors heading for the exit, customers all running, and of course, most significantly, it can spread fear and confusion amongst the workforce. So, if badly managed, the intangible costs of a crisis can be much, much greater than the fixed costs, such as the financial sanction imposed. So why is this important? Turning now to Barclays as the example. Barclays, as early as 2005, there was evidence to suggest that traders at Barclays were seeking to influence LIBOR. On the 29th of May 2008, Barclays agreed internally to tell the media that it had always quoted accurate and fair LIBOR. But on the 27th of June 2012, so some 4 years later, the FCA announced a £59.5 million fine against Barclays, which was by far the largest at the time, I think. With the concurrent investigations by the DOJ and the CFTC, the total fines imposed on the 27th of June were £290 million. But by the 28th of June, so the following day, these announcements had wiped £3.2 billion off Barclays' share price, which reflected public and political outrage. Now, I suggest that the diminution of share price seen not only reflects the financial sanctions imposed, but also was a direct consequence of reputation harm. Now, why have I chosen Barclays as a case study? Well, Barclays had hoped that by moving first amongst the banks that were under investigation for LIBOR, and by settling with the FCA at a very early stage and communicating that settlement to the public, that they would win reprieve from a forgiving public, limit and mitigate reputation harm to the bank, and therefore limit the impact on the share price. However, and this is important, the FCA announcement was coupled or accompanied by a very public letter from the then CEO, Bob Diamond, to the Treasury Select Committee, in which he accepted that the bank's behaviour was wrong, but he defended elements of the traders' practice, saying that they were acting in their shareholders' best interests. And he also pointed the finger at other banks in the market at the time, seeking to spread the blame, seemingly. So on the one hand, it's mea culpa at the earliest possible opportunity, but it's a qualified mea culpa. So Mr. Diamond then went on to give an extremely challenging, some would say almost embarrassing performance in front of the Treasury Select Committee, and he refused to be drawn on whether he would take a bonus that year. And the following week, members of the Treasury Select Committee said that Mr. Diamond had not been fully honest with them when he gave evidence. And indeed, Andrew Tyree, the chairman, suggested that he had taken a cavalier attitude to Parliament and shown a complete lack of candour. But Barclays' turmoil continues. Jess Staley, the now chief executive, was involved in a reputation scandal where he sought to unmask a whistleblower within the bank, and the financial penalty that is being imposed upon Barclays as a result has not been yet announced, but what has the media reporting of this latest scandal has focused on is the fact that Jess Staley was due to receive a £1 million bonus in 2017. Not only that, but you also have the ongoing prosecution of all the traders involved and their various appeals, all of which serve to force Barclays lower and lower and lower in the public perception. So what about the Estonian financial services reputation threats? And I've tried to focus on what I see as being the individual risks, or risks rather to individual banks rather than to the market as a whole. Firstly, regulatory intervention. The Estonian financial services sector is very bank-focused and concentrated, and the assets of the 5 largest credit institutions account for some 90% of the total assets of the banking sector in Estonia. The banking sector, as you will know, it's not large. It comprises less than 20 banks, mostly Scandinavian-owned, EFSA regulated, but each one of these banks has systemic importance to the Estonian economy. Foreign banks, of course, foreign-owned banks, are also vulnerable to the acts or omissions of their parent company abroad. Cybercrime, something that's been dealt with a lot during the course of the presentation this morning. According to the FCA, data hacking against financial services firms quadrupled between 2016 and 2017. Now, the sector is, of course, targeted in part because of the data and the finance flows that it controls, but there is an increasing rise on what we call the ideological hacker, activist groups that are growing in size and sophistication, who hack into banks not for financial gain, but for because they believe it's the right thing to do, their anti-capitalist agenda. And their disruptive reputational and financial impact and the publicity they generate, often working with the media to do so, can be huge. Estonia is, of course, like many countries, is at heightened risk of cyber attack. And I think in 2007, following a disputed relocation of a Soviet-era bronze soldier monument, Estonia faced cyber attacks that have been widely acknowledged as being the world's first cyber war. At the peak of these attacks, 58 Estonian websites were offline at any one particular time, including those of government newspapers and indeed banks. I've also included commercial civil fraud litigation. I act in a lot of cases in the UK courts for banks who are pursuing, for example, debtors for claims. And quite often the response is, well, this is theft of state assets, this is a politically motivated claim, and certainly within the domestic market in which the bank is situated, because these trials quite often happen out of jurisdiction, the allegations made and the counterclaimants made by the defendants can have considerable reputation impact on the business. And finally, software failure. Very relevant again in the UK at the moment because of TSB, who I'm sure many of you will have heard about their recent software debacle. They were moving customers to an online platform. It was an incredibly complex process. And there was a total loss of mobile banking application and online services. On the 25th of April, that's of course this year, Paul Pester, the TSB chief executive, wrote on Twitter, perhaps some would say slightly ill-advisedly, "Our mobile banking app and online banking are now up and running. Thank you for your patience." By that evening, he was obviously holding himself a hostage to fortune there, but by that evening he had received 1,300 tweets from angry customers saying that they could still not access their accounts. In fact, it wasn't up and running at all. It was operating at best at 50% capacity. It was then reported in the media that the Spanish owners of TSB had cut considerable corners with cost, and that may have been the reasons why there was a complete software failures. But customers have gone on to report that they couldn't access their accounts, that they've lost funds, and these are problems that are still ongoing right as we speak, some considerable time after Paul Pester sent that fateful tweet. TSB have finally, about time, instructed an independent law firm now to look into what has happened, what's got wrong, in an effort to put this crisis behind the bank and limit any further reputation damage to the business. So what is reputation cost? How do you measure it? It is a business-critical and somewhat hidden cost. Key to the fair market valuation of a business is the perception of the value of the company in the future. And the fixed costs of a crisis, so for example, the legal costs, the increased insurance, and any financial penalty that may be imposed on a business or a bank, but also the intangible costs, perception of corporate governance, brand image, reputation harm, customer and client churn, can have a considerable deleterious impact on fair market valuation. So reduction of intangible costs is absolutely key, and that can be achieved by integrating crisis and litigation communications planning into the overall business plan, and by the communications function better engaging with the legal function to understand the business critical risks. I've cited regulatory intervention as a particular example of a particular business critical risk, and that is exaggerated if that intervention is suggestive or indicative in any way of criminality within the bank or within the business. A few years ago, I was lucky enough to share a panel with a chap called John Armour, who was an Oxford academic of law and commerce. And he actually had looked at this particular area and had sought to measure reputation cost to businesses that were under FSA, Financial Services Authority, supervision and investigation, and measure the impacts on share price. And he found that the impact on share price was, on average, 9 times as much as the financial sanction that was ultimately imposed on the bank. And if you measure impact on share price as reputation cost, you can see the catastrophic impact that it can have on a bank. Interestingly, reputation cost was only really brought into play if the behavior complained of by the regulator was actions against customers or those trading directly to the bank. If the behavior complained of was against third parties, the same principles did not apply. But be that as it may, on average, 9 times as much as the financial sanction imposed. The Estonian media landscape recently ranked as satisfactory, which is perhaps not the best word to use, given that it in fact ranked 12th in the 2018 World Press Freedom Index. That is exceptionally high. It's up 2 from 2016. It was also 12th in 2017. It's way above the UK, which is down in 40th. And of course, the Estonian constitution provides for considerable press freedom. It has a good broad spectrum of cross-media, traditional, digital, broadcast, and an inquisitive sector of journalists and of course an inquisitive public which fuels independent journalism. So what does that mean? That means that communications can be highly effective in mitigating and limiting the reputational impact on a business. It's much less so where, for example, the media is state-owned or owned by vested interests. And I've acted in a number of cases where the media is actually controlled by individuals that are involved in whatever issue we're acting in. So litigation against, for example, oligarchs in London, where they own the media in their nation state. It's much harder to insert your narrative into a media if your enemy own that media. So the media landscape in Estonia provides for fertile ground for proper reputational mitigation. Now looking at trust, what are the global trends in trust? Because this is also an important guide for communications. So the Edelman Trust Barometer is a global survey that's been running for about 18 years of 33,000 respondents across 28 countries. It's the largest global survey of trust. And the results were published for this year at the beginning of the year. And the results were really interesting. Firstly, there was a global trend towards an unwillingness to believe information. Secondly, trust in traditional and social media had actually fallen for the first time in some considerable time. Now, why is that? I suggest three reasons. Firstly, and briefly, we all hear today about fake news. Secondly, widespread reporting of foreign states intervening or interfering in election campaigns. And finally, the partisan nature of media reporting on social media platforms. So if I'm a Conservative supporter and I regularly research stories online about the Conservatives, I'm constantly fed conservative supportive material and never arguments from the other side. And people are very tuned into this as an issue now, particularly after the Cambridge Analytica scandals in the UK. So trust in social media platforms are down. But there is a renewed trust in experts and CEOs. And this is really important because it tells us how we can engage better with media. The types of individuals that I've been lucky enough to share with this platform with today are the sorts of individuals that should be engaging with the media in order to get their business's narrative out. Chief executives first and foremost. They really need to lead the story. So that's really the sort of background to and scene setting to reputation, resilience and risk in the Estonian financial services market. What I want to do now is briefly touch on, in the time I've got left, which is not much, the reputation response. And firstly, I want to look at perception, because before a crisis even touches a business, perception of that business is so important. If a business operates at a negative baseline opinion, not only does it mean that a crisis is more likely to take hold, but it also means that crisis will stick with the business for much longer. If it's a positive baseline opinion, if the company is positively regarded amongst the public and amongst the media, then the story is not only less likely to take hold and less likely to permeate in the media, but people are more likely to give the business the benefits of the doubt. So how can businesses better improve their perception in the public domain? Again, that's the CEO-led narrative. The CEO, the management of the business needs to step out front foot and highlight the positive things that the business are doing. But part of that is also, apologies, a risk audit and a reputation audit. Communicate with stakeholders, understand how the business is perceived in the marketplace, where are the weak spots and where are the spots that can be built on and capitalized on. Resilience and response, key to any crisis response, and this applies as much to any business as it does to a bank within the financial services sector. Key to a crisis response is preparation. And surprisingly few businesses properly prepare for the risks that they face. In the UK, from banks facing regulatory investigation or the prospect of a dawn raid by the Serious Fraud Office, to law firms that were caught up in the Me Too scandal, they all got caught with their proverbial trousers down, and none of them knew how to handle the communications issues around the particular crisis. They had quite clear legal objectives in mind, but communicating not only within the business but also to media, none of them knew what to do. And of course, poor preparation leads to poor and impulsive decision-making, and that will have a reputation impact on the business. And the cost of preparation is minimal. So I've just highlighted a few of the sort of key stages in preparation. Risk assessment, what are the key business risks? 2, the team structure is so important, and that's something I'll talk about in a moment. Who's going to say what to whom and when? 3, what are the protocols going to be? Crises happen unbelievably quickly, and in this day and age, in the media and social media, they can pick up and a narrative can take hold and destroy the reputation of a business in a mere matter of moments. So protocols need to be put in place in advance. Issues in crisis media training. Many management at the top of business understand how to properly communicate their latest products or the positive things that the bank are doing, but they don't understand how to be challenged and how to face adversarial interrogation by media. And then, of course, if you've done 1 to 4 properly, 5 should come naturally, and the response should be executed in such a way that it's absolutely seamless and the reputation harm to the bank is minimal. Very, very quickly, because I'm very low on time, building the right team. These are the key components to crisis management within a bank, again, within any business. The most important aspect of crisis management is the pre-existing understanding and the plan that extends from the CEO, management, general counsel, all the external legal advisors, the internal and the external communications advisors, that in addition to the legal objectives, ensures that the reputation and the value of the business is properly protected. And this really is the core team that can be mobilized in the event of a crisis or litigious issue for the business. The IR function is incredibly important within that process and its relationship with the communications and the internal and external communications function. Looking at the external communications, most of the key decisions and interactions with the regulators and the authorities during a crisis, of course, will fall to the management, general counsel and external legal advisors. However, it's essential to ensure that all the parts of the business work together to communicate with the market, with the media, to ensure calm consistency of messaging and to help preserve the value of the business. And planning is absolutely essential to that. So a communications response must be informed. It must be informed of the basic law behind the particular issue, and it'll be the responsibility of the investor and the public-facing functions of the business to take complex legal issues, discuss them with management and legal teams, and reduce them into a form of words that are suitable for any particular audience. This, of course, has to be done in such a way that does not offend the overall legal objectives and the business objectives of the business. So legal understanding and collaboration is essential. Communications must be carefully coordinated. They must be calm, confident, and consistent. And finally, one that's not on there is they must be careful. It may seem obvious, but never discuss the particular crisis or the particular issue in the public domain. I've had it in the past where management of a very large business were on their way to an EGM. They were travelling on a train. They were openly discussing the issues, the crisis that was to be raised by the shareholders at the EGM on the train. The nature of their conversation was recorded by a person sitting next to them on the train, who then posted it on the business's website. Now, you can prepare for many things, but you can't prepare for that degree of stupidity. So be careful. And finally, restoring value, reputation restoration. A crisis should not be the lasting legacy of a business. Businesses need to be transparent. They need to conduct policy change. They need to demonstrate that they've learnt, and then they need to move on and shift the conversation from the crises to the positive future of the business. And the senior management, the chief executive, has a vital role to play in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antony. Kas meil on küsimusi saalist?
Yes, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I have a question concerning the press freedom, and there have been very interesting figures. You have indicated that Estonia is on the 12th place and UK is on the 40th place.
Yeah.
And as we know, today's world, the press has a huge power to kill your business, for example. What's wrong with the press freedom in UK? UK is one of the oldest democracies, and why the ranking is on the 40th place? Could you explain a little bit? Thank you.
Well, the UK fared very badly after the phone hacking scandal, which may have been reported in Estonia, I don't know, where journalists had been hacking into the phones of celebrities and reporting their movements in a way that immediately gave the celebrities the understanding that their phone had been hacked. And it really hit the headlines when a journalist hacked into the phone of a young girl called Millie Dowler, who was abducted and murdered. And rather than passing the information they found to the police, because her phone was, I don't think, ever found, they used it to report on her movements, but in a manner that suggested that she may still be alive, when in fact she wasn't. Now, following that, there was a huge inquiry, a very highly publicised inquiry into the phone hacking scandal, conducted by a judge of the Supreme Court in London that lasted very, very many months. But as is often the case, there was also a political backlash against the press. And the press is obviously regulated, but new regulations were put in place whereby the press were required to sign up to various standards, and if they didn't sign up to those standards, the sanctions against them in the case of any breach of press laws would be very, very, very much greater. Now, at the time, there was a huge outcry at the impact that would have on press freedom, and it was that constitutional composition, I think, that has meant that the UK now fares fairly badly. But you know, we still, I hope, have the BBC and leading outlets. So I think that whilst the phone hacking scandal shone a very important light on a very serious issue, it has placed limits on reporting that certainly many in the media would argue strongly against.
Okay, do we have any other questions? No. Thank you very much.